David Rose is with me this afternoon. He's an UMSL economist, and we get his thoughts from time to time on what's happening with the economy. The jobless figures came out last week, and the unemployment rate stayed flat. So, David, let me get your thoughts on that first and foremost. On the unemployment front, were you surprised by that, or is that sort of what you expected?
I think that fits the basic pattern of most recoveries. The unemployment rate is going to always lag the recovery elsewhere in the economy. The economy is growing reasonably rapidly at this point. It seems like every time we have a recession, people think there's something different about this one, that the unemployment rate doesn't come down sooner, but that's a pretty standard thing.
So it sort of fits the pattern.
Yes.
But the concern all along has been that we hear this term that this is a jobless recovery. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So far. But again, I'm sure if you look back in the media, you'd hear the same sort of thing with other recoveries at this point.
And as far as the rest of the economic picture right now, is it the same as other recoveries, or are there warning signs?
I think I'm not quite as sanguine about that. I think there are warning signs down the road. The thing that I'm concerned about is that there's so much high-powered money left in the system that the Fed is going to have a difficult problem pulling back bank reserves when they're confronted with the possibility that if they do so, interest rates will go up, and then there'll be political pressure on them to not have the interest rates go up and thereby kill off the recovery. I think they can do it. I think it's possible for the Federal Reserve to do it. They have the tools, and I think they've got it more or less figured out how to do that without causing a great deal of inflation. The question is, will they have the political will to do it, and will they have the political support to do it? So as far as that goes, I'm not too worried about inflation in the future on that. But the thing I'm worried about is the potential for significant inflation in the not-too-distant future because of continuing increase in debt.
And let's talk a little bit about that and get a little more specific, because obviously the debt is growing, and if I'm not mistaken, the figure that came out from the CBO last week was pretty stunning. We're talking about in the next 10 years, unprecedented levels of debt. So when you look toward the near term, perhaps it's not as big of a problem, but are you talking about some of the concerns you have down the line?
Yeah, one of the things that's been a time bomb that's been building, and it's hard to perceive it building, has been the unfunded liability crisis. So think of it this way. Imagine there's a bucket in a room, and there's a drip in the ceiling, and the drip is landing in the bucket. Somebody else put the bucket there. You didn't know it was there. That bucket can fill up a long time before it overflows. So there's a process by which a bad outcome is going to happen, and it's been going on and on and on and on. And the longer it goes on, the worse it gets. But until the water gets over the top, you don't really perceive of the mounting problem. That's the kind of situation we have with the unfunded liability crisis. Because with Medicare and Social Security, what's happening is the amount of money being taxed from workers today is more than enough to cover the outlays for retirees. Okay, there's a positive difference, and that's being put in a trust fund.
But we're about to turn up the spigot, if you will.
Well, and even if we didn't turn up the spigot, the bottom line is what's going to happen is the number of retirees is going to get so large relative to the number of workers that the amount of money coming in is going to be less than the amount of money going out, and the Social Security trust fund that was built up will be revealed to be nothing but paper, which is exactly what it is. There's really no money in there the way we would normally think of it. And so immediately there will be pressure to engage in more deficit spending or increase taxes.
The figure that I heard from the CBO, I just want to get your reaction to this. The report that came out last week was that the budget from the president sends the U.S. government to a potential tipping point where debt reaches 90% of GDP. This year, the debt will reach 63% of GDP, and there are some economists, some of your colleagues, Carmen Reinhart at the University of Maryland, Kenneth Rogoff at Harvard, that says that when you get to that 90% mark, sounds high to me, that usually touches off a crisis. Two questions. First, do you agree with that? And second, does it really take getting to 90% before you have a crisis?
Around 90% historically does produce a crisis, and there's ample data. Ken Rogoff, who you mentioned, wrote a fascinating book that just came out about 6 months ago titled "This Time is Different," and he looks at I think about 800 years of past data and how we see this sort of thing happening again and again and again in societies where a society will live beyond its means. It can do it for a long time. So,
Japan is an example of that, right?
Japan was an example of that. Rome, of course, is the ultimate example of that. We've had it in our country, but historically, when things got a little out of hand, we did a mid-course correction and solved the problem. We've had a couple periods, for example, when Social Security was getting a bit out of control, and we put together a commission and fixed the problem, at least for the short term, usually by increasing payroll taxes. We had the problem in another form in the late 70s. We had debt rising very rapidly, and that was causing the Fed to have to effectively monetize it, and that of course led to a great deal of inflation. And we all know what happened from 1981 to 1983. It was kind of very, very tough period of fixing that, so it was fixed. So it is possible for countries to come back from the brink, but typically they don't. One thing that's interesting about this debt ratio you were mentioning, what they were mentioning there was public debt, but arguably the gross debt is the better number to use, because the public debt is essentially the gross debt minus the Social Security obligations. But since that is really empty, there's no value to these securities that they put in this trust fund. I think really the gross debt is the right number to look at, and that would be over 100% by next year for sure.
Already. Yeah. And one of the things, I want to get your thoughts on this final question here. One of the things that's being discussed, it seems to me more and more, in relation to how to afford to do everything that we're doing, is the implementation of some sort of value-added tax, of that tax. You think that we're headed down that way?
Charles Krauthammer, about 2 weeks ago, predicted that by the end of the year, the great debate would be in this country over having a national sales tax. Now, as you know, because of about my work on using vouchers to solve the medical reform problem, many people were against that because of a national sales tax. So when I heard Charles mention that, it was a great irritation on my part. Here's this thing that couldn't even be considered for a voucher program to maintain a private medical system, and then we may end up having to do it anyway.